Thus far in the course, we've been considering in some detail questions concerning what is required for free will and responsibility, as well as philosophical and scientific work that bears on the substantive questions about whether we actually have what it takes, whether we have what is required of free will at all. But until now, we've set aside what many take to be the most pressing questions, the prescriptive and ethical ones about free will and responsibility. The notion of free will is, as we've seen, deeply connected to the notion of moral responsibility. If it turns out that we don't have free will, should we continue to hold people responsible? Should we continue to blame them the way we do? Or should we radically overhaul our ethical systems? This lecture begins our exploration of those kinds of prescriptive questions. There are some basic ethical notions that we need to articulate before we proceed. One branch of ethics, known as normative ethics, attempts to determine the central principles that we should follow if we're to lead a moral life. And the aim of this branch of ethics is to figure out how to live by trying to identify principles or rules that you can sort of guide your life by, to use as guides for life. And the presumption is that there will be some principles that we can figure out that will give you a roadmap for living an ethical life. The two most prominent approaches in this area of ethics are consequentialism and deontology. Consequentialism, the name consequentialism actually contains the view in a nice way. It maintains that the moral worth of an action is entirely a function of the consequences of the action. So if you want to know whether or not an action is good, morally good, you only need to look at the consequences of the action. The most familiar version of this view is utilitarianism, which says that in any circumstance, the best action is the one that will bring about the best consequences for everyone involved. And the most prominent version of utilitarianism promotes what's called the greatest happiness principle. And that says that the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarianism, this sort of prominent consequentialist theory, fits with much of common sense morality. Often when we make moral decisions, we think it should be done on the basis of what would produce the best consequences. So consider cases of triage, that medical assistance arrives at an accident site and there are limited resources, both people and supplies. The medical professionals have to make a decision about who to treat and who not to treat. Those decisions are made on the basis of what the best overall outcomes will be. Suppose they determine that given their resources, they can either save one person who is very badly off or three people who are less badly off. In that case, we would think that it's obviously okay for them to save the three. Saving three instead of one is the best outcome, and that makes it morally acceptable. Philosophers characteristically try to develop examples that are more colorful, so here's an example that will come up a couple of times in the course. Imagine a speeding train hurtling down the tracks. There happen to be 5 innocent people on the track who will be killed. John is standing by the track next to a switch that he knows will divert the train to a sidetrack and save the 5 people. But there's somebody on the sidetrack as well, and he'll be killed if John pulls the switch. The only way for John to save the 5 is to pull the switch. So he does it, but it ends up saving the 5 and killing the 1. If you ask people, was it morally okay for John to do that? Was it okay for him to pull the switch? Well, philosophers think the answer is yes. And recently, a number of psychologists and philosophers have started to ask people these kinds of questions. And what they found is that people, too, tend to say, yeah, it's okay to pull the switch in that case. And if you ask them why, they'll say, well, because you get to save 5 people if you do that as opposed to saving 1. So in cases like this, people tend to think that it's good to perform the act that produces the best consequences. The other prominent approach that we'll consider, deontology, focuses on moral duties rather than on consequences. And while this doesn't have the sort of natural language ring to it that consequentialism does, the term deontology comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty or obligation. And the deontologist maintains that certain actions are wrong even if they produce better utilitarian consequences. So instead of focusing on the consequences of an action, what comes out from the action, deontology focuses on a person's intention. So they think the issue is whether a person intended to abide by the moral obligations that they have. And this kind of a view also fits with much of common sense morality. So let's take an example that's similar to the example with the train before. Imagine that Bill is standing on a footbridge over the train tracks. Again, there's a train hurtling forward, and the train will kill 5 innocent people. There's an innocent stranger wearing a large backpack who's standing next to Bill on the footbridge. In a flash, Bill realizes that the only way to stop the train and save the 5 is to push this man, backpack and all, in front of the train. He does this, thereby saving the 5 people on the tracks, but killing the 1. Was that morally okay? Well, philosophers have tended to resist the idea that that was okay. And when psychologists and philosophers have asked normal people tend to say, no, it's not okay for Bill to push the guy in front of the train. And if you ask why, their answer will be something like, well, you just can't kill innocent people. And that fits well with the idea of deontology, that there are certain duties that we shouldn't violate, even if it would produce better consequences. Today we'll focus on deontology, and so we'll consider the issue in much more detail and consider utilitarianism in detail in the next lecture. The most prominent figure in this tradition is Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804. Kant is in fact one of the greatest philosophers in history. He's perhaps the favorite example of an abstruse systematic philosopher. He developed a huge philosophical system that really transformed Western philosophy in every area. Kant, the person, lived a really tame life. He never ventured far outside of his hometown. He probably never had sex. He certainly never got married. And this, the marriage part anyway, was because he never felt financially stable enough to get married until he was fairly advanced in age, at which point he thought there was no purpose in getting married. Philosophy didn't pay much back then. It doesn't pay much now either, but in Kant's case, he worked for 15 years as an unsalaried professor, and his pay came directly from the students who attended his lectures. Fortunately for Kant, he was an extremely popular lecturer, which after reading his books you might find somewhat surprising. The books are really technical and challenging and full of specialized terminology, but many of his ideas are really captivating, and in his ethical work, Kant sets out several important features of deontological ethics. So first, of course, as a deontologist, Kant thinks morality is and should be based on our duties. We have the duty not to hurt innocent people. We have a duty to keep our promises, a duty not to lie. Acting in accordance with our duties is what matters for ethics. Since it's doing one's duty that matters, the consequences don't dictate morality. Killing an innocent person is the kind of action that is simply forbidden, regardless of the consequences. So if you want to know whether killing a certain innocent person is morally wrong, you don't need to contemplate the other consequences of the act. You don't need to say, well, what would be the benefits that would accrue from killing this innocent person? Indeed, Kant and others think that would just be corrupt to even think that way. To think that you calculate what would happen if you kill an innocent person, and that's how you figure out whether it's okay to kill an innocent person, then that's just completely wrong-headed. Kant thinks that it's even a bit more subtle than that we need to identify what makes an action morally right or wrong. It isn't the outcome of the action, but what's really important is the intention. So it isn't whether or not somebody dies as a result of behavior, it's the intention that you have in producing the action. And there are many ways that you can have slips between your intention and the outcome. So let's say that I try to save a drowning child because I'm the only one there who can swim, but I actually caused the child's death unintentionally. Kant says that morally, what matters is the fact that I intended to help. It's sad that the child died, but I did the right thing if I acted on the basis of morally good intentions. Or to take the other end of things, suppose I try to kill someone, but the result is that I fail and inadvertently save a bunch of innocent people. Even though the outcome is good, my action was morally wrong, Kant would say, just as much as if I'd killed the person and saved no one. My action was wrong because what makes an action morally wrong is that it was produced by a bad intention. And if I intended to kill an innocent person and followed through on that intention, then that action was morally wrong, even if it had good consequences. So what is the intention that one should have for one's action to be morally right? Kant says that we have to have the intention to do the right thing, to do one's moral duty. That's the intention that matters. Some philosophers had claimed that when we behave morally, we do it because it's emotionally gratifying to behave morally. For Kant, doing something because it's emotionally gratifying doesn't count as moral at all. Actions that are driven by passions have no moral worth, he thinks. So if you do something because it makes you feel good, then it doesn't count as a moral action. Moral actions are those that you do out of no concern for yourself. They're not the kind of thing you do because you get some feely reward out of it. So in order for your action to be moral, you have to understand, first of all, that the action that you're considering is the moral one, and second one, you have to do it precisely because it is the moral one. So if you save a drowning child because you want to impress a girl or a boy, then your action isn't genuinely moral, that you're doing it out of self-interest in that case. In order for your action to be moral, it has to be done for the moral reason. You save the child because morality obliges you to save the child. So far, we've been considering when an action is morally right or morally wrong. And this also provides the basis for praising and blaming people. We praise people when their actions are morally good. We blame them when their actions are morally bad. And what makes the actions morally good or bad are the intentions. It follows from all this that when we praise and blame people, what we focus on are their intentions and not the consequences of their actions. According to Kant, it would just be bizarre to blame me for an unlucky outcome, say accidentally causing a child to drown, when my intention was morally good. And now we can draw the connection to free will. We blame people when they've done something morally wrong. To do something morally wrong is to do something with bad intentions, and the reason it's appropriate to blame a person for her bad intentions is because a person has the free will to choose her intentions. By contrast, many of the features of the consequences of our actions are out of our control, and that's why it's inappropriate to blame you for the consequences. Those can occur for reasons that are not within the purview of your free will. But what you intend to do is in your control. You have the free will to form a good intention or a bad intention. And that's the appropriate basis for casting moral praise or blame on you. In this respect, then, deontological ethics, with its focus on blaming people for bad intentions, fits really well with the idea of free will. The way we normally think about blaming people seems to fit with these ideas from deontology. People are blamed when they freely choose to act on a bad intention. Now, so far we've been focusing on Kant, and the fact is, though, that most philosophers who accept deontology would accept almost everything in the preceding account. Kant's important for being very clear, but many others had these kinds of ideas. But Kant has an additional and really distinctive contribution here, and it forms the basis for a really intriguing argument for free will. So I want to pursue it in some detail. Although I made it sound like I answered the question, what is the intention we should have? What's the right thing to do? I didn't really tell you anything very specific. I just said the right thing to do is to do the moral act because it's the moral act. And I took it for granted that it's morally right to save drowning children and wrong to kill innocent people. But I didn't say anything more to defend that assumption. And it's a notoriously hard business to defend these kinds of basic moral principles. These are deep philosophical questions, and Kant has an extremely influential proposal about how to address them. As I said initially, this part of ethics focuses on the question, what principles should I live by? What are the guiding principles of morality? And Kant thinks that there is a single, universally applicable moral law that tells us what to do. That's a really bold claim. Now, how does he explain it? Like other normative ethicists, Kant thinks that we need to identify the principles that we're going to live by, and the moral law will be a principle like that. We need to recognize that our lives are guided by principles in different ways, though, and that's going to be important to articulating his view. So Kant says that a person might live by the principle, I will avenge any insult, but they might act on that principle without thinking that they ought to act on it. He might just have adopted it and said, look, this is the way I do things. It might be better to illustrate his point with an example he doesn't use that's more trivial than vengeance. So let's say I decide that from now on, the only kind of shirt I will wear are t-shirts, right after I finish these lectures, because the teaching company doesn't let you wear t-shirts. But I just decide that that's what I'm going to do. And if in a month someone says, "Why did you decide always to wear t-shirts?" I say, "Because I felt like it." In that case, I've adopted a principle that I'll live by. Now, this all seems artificial since that kind of principle is unlikely to be very important. But surely it's possible to adopt such a principle just because you feel like it. Now, the reason we need to acknowledge this is that Kant wants to use it to emphasize that this kind of principle, one that we adopt just because we feel like it, couldn't possibly be the moral law. The moral law can't just be the policies I adopt because I feel like it. That doesn't even have the right structure. At a minimum, the moral law has to be a law, and that means it has to tell us what we ought to do. To advance this issue, Kant uses a notion familiar from grammar classes, the imperative. In grammar class, you learn that imperative sentences issue commands like shut the door, chew with your mouth closed. And the way Kant puts it is that an imperative tells us what we ought to do. And that, of course, is what a law does. But now we need to make an important distinction. Some imperatives only apply because we have a goal that we want to achieve. So let's say you have the goal to kiss the Blarney Stone. Well, an imperative naturally follows from that. You have to go to Ireland. If your goal is to kiss the Blarney Stone, you ought to have the goal to go to Ireland, or you should give up your goal for kissing the Blarney Stone. Unlike the example of deciding to wear a t-shirt because I feel like it, if my goal is to kiss the Blarney Stone, then I ought to go to Ireland. That's what makes it an imperative. Or think about someone having the goal to lick the soft coral on the Great Barrier Reef. That is a disgusting and ill-advised goal. But if you take the goal as given, then an imperative follows. You ought to go to Australia. So we have real imperatives here. But neither of these kinds of imperatives can be a law, according to Kant. And that's because you're under no obligation to have those goals, licking soft coral or kissing the Blarney Stone. So Kant would call those imperatives hypothetical imperatives. They apply hypothetically. They only apply to you if you have a certain goal. But the moral law, he says, has to be something that doesn't depend on our goals. Recall the earlier point that intentions to serve our own self-interested goals don't count as moral intentions at all. And this leads Kant to propose that in addition to hypothetical imperatives, there's also an imperative that doesn't depend on our goals, and that's the categorical imperative. I've noticed that students often find this term categorical imperative really ominous, but we already know what imperative means, a statement that we ought to do something, and the term categorical is actually familiar. It's the same term that's used when some politician says that he categorically denies that he goes to prostitutes. That means the denial is absolute and unqualified. Similarly, the categorical imperative is an imperative that is absolute. It says what we ought to do without any hedging or qualifying. So the categorical imperative tells us what we ought to do full stop. Regardless of our particular goals, we ought to act in certain ways. Kant's best-known formulation of the categorical imperative is a bit technical, but here's an approximation that's close enough for our purposes. The categorical imperative says that I should only act on the basis of a principle that I would have everyone act on. That is, I should only decide to follow a principle if I'd be willing to say, everyone in a similar situation to the one I'm in should follow the same principle. For instance, suppose Tim needs money, but he knows that the only way to get a loan is to lie to an associate that he will pay him back. Kant says that to decide whether that action is moral, Tim needs to ask himself whether he would have everyone in a similar situation do the same thing, namely, lie to their associate. Kant thinks it will be obvious to any rational person that the answer is no, and that tells us, and Tim, that the action is morally wrong. So Kant says, I can see for myself why lying is wrong. It's wrong because it's not the sort of thing that I would have other people do, so I shouldn't do it myself either. And I can appreciate this simply by thinking about the categorical imperative. for that tells me that I shouldn't act on a principle unless I would have everybody else do the same. Kant thinks that the categorical imperative can generate all the particular duties we have: not to kill the innocent, not to lie, to keep our promises. Once you think about what principles you would have other people follow, you will see that it's wrong to harm the innocent, wrong to lie, and so forth. Furthermore, Kant thinks that all rational beings, and that includes all of us, can appreciate the categorical imperative, or something close to it. He writes, quote, "Although, no doubt, common men do not conceive it in such an abstract and universal form, yet they always have it really before their eyes and use it as the standard of their decision." Kant maintains that the fact that we are rational enough to understand and abide by the moral law suffices to make us obligated to follow it. Now, that was a very quick tour of some tough moral philosophy. Kant now develops into an argument for the existence of free will. First, though, it's worth noting that in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is Kant's great work, he maintained that there are compelling arguments both for and against the existence of free will. He thought the fact that reason could produce such compelling arguments for contradictory conclusions was an important illustration of the limits of reason. And that was one of the central themes of the Critique of Pure Reason. Philosophers, he thought, had been too optimistic about our ability to figure out what reality is really like beneath our perceptions. And the problem of free will is supposed to be an illustration of this deep limitation. So in that work, he refrained from confirming or denying the existence of free will. But Kant does develop an argument in favor of free will in his later book, The Critique of Practical Reason. That book develops his ethical theory in the wake of the earlier book, The Critique of Pure Reason. And the argument begins with the moral law that we just examined in the form of the categorical imperative, which is the moral law. In earlier ethical writings, Kant tried to offer proofs of the moral law, but when he got around to writing the Critique of Practical Reason, he does something apparently different. He says that our consciousness of the moral law is a, quote, fact of reason. It forces itself on us, he says. The idea seems to be that the moral law is a fact of which we're all aware, just in virtue of being rational. It's something that we can all recognize as clearly right. Perhaps we don't think of it exactly as the categorical imperative, but in some form we realize that it's wrong to act on a principle that we wouldn't want anyone else to operate on. Now, since it's a fact that there's a moral law, Kant says, that means that we're obligated to behave in certain ways. We're obligated to keep our promises. We're obligated not to lie. That's part of what it is for there to be a moral law. It puts obligations on us. Recall here the difference between the moral law and hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives say, if you want to kiss the Blarney Stone, you ought to go to Ireland. But it's open to us to ask, why on earth would you want to kiss the Blarney Stone? More importantly, even though I might not share your goal of kissing the Blarney Stone, I might think, if that's so important to you, buy a plane ticket and go kiss the thing. If that's your goal, then go do it. You should go to Ireland. You should, because that is necessary for your goal, idiosyncratic as your goal may be. That's not at all how it is with the moral law. The moral law says, I don't care what your goal is. You should keep your promises. At this point in Kant's argument for free will, he invokes the familiar principle that we saw earlier, that ought implies can. This seems like a really intuitive idea. So suppose Mary says that John ought to have swum to the rescue of the drowning child, but it turns out that John's arms were both badly broken. Then it seems like Mary was wrong to say that John ought to have swum to the rescue. There was no way John could swim under those conditions, and that absolves John of any blame for his failing to swim. Now we can apply this principle to the moral law. Just as it only makes sense to say that John ought to swim to the child, if it's also true that John can swim to the child. So it also only makes sense to say that John ought to tell the truth if he can tell the truth. And this brings us to determinism and free will. Because if determinism is true, then we can only do whatever we're determined to do. It will never be the case that we ought to have done something else, because it will never be possible that we could have done something else. According to determinism, everything I do is inevitable. So let's suppose that I told a lie yesterday, that I told my students that I toiled over their papers for hours when I really zipped through them like lightning so I could get to what I really wanted to do. If we accept the principle that ought implies can, then to say that I ought not to have lied to my students implies that I could have done something different. I could have refrained from lying. But if determinism is true, it wasn't possible for me to do anything other than lie. My lying yesterday was determined from before I was born. So if determinism is true, then it can't be true that I ought to have refrained from lying because I couldn't do anything else. And that means it doesn't make sense to say that I ought to have done anything else. For if you say that I ought to have refrained from lying, that means that I could have refrained from lying. Determinism leaves no room for that. And at this point, Kant makes a really interesting move. He says, look, we all know the fact that there's a moral law. That's just the obvious point above. Everyone can see that we ought to obey the moral law. But since we ought to obey the moral law, that means we can obey the moral law, and that means determinism has to be false. So to repeat, the argument goes as follows. We know as a fact of reason that there is a moral law. The law tells us that we ought to act in certain ways. For instance, it's a consequence of the law that I should keep my promises. If that's right, if we ought to act in accordance with the law, if I ought to keep my promises, then that means that I can act in accordance with the law. I can keep my promises. If I break the moral law by breaking my promise, but it's also true that I ought to have abided by the moral law, that means I could have abided by the law. I could have kept my promises. And that, Kant says, proves that determinism is false. Because if determinism is true, then it can't be the case that I ought to have kept my promise. If determinism is true, then it was inevitable that I would break my promise, and so I would be exempt from the moral law. But it's evident, Kant says, that I'm not exempt from the moral law, and that proves that I do have free will. This is really an ingenious argument. It starts from a view about normative ethics, about the right way to live, and it uses that to try to prove that we have to have free will. It's incredibly clever, but there might be a storm in the silver lining. It sets up a real worry, because Kant seems to show that deontological ethics, the idea that there's a law that we have to follow, he seems to show that that requires that we have free will. If I have a moral duty to keep my promises, then I have to have the free will to keep my promises. Then he says that since we really do have obligations to keep our promises, we must have free will. But you might worry that the argument runs equally well in the opposite direction. So let's say you start from the free will skeptic position and you reject the existence of free will. Then you could use that to derive the rejection of morality. As we've already seen, a number of philosophers and scientists have argued on independent grounds that we don't have free will, either because determinism is true or because the notion of free will has requirements that can't be met. If the free will skeptics are right that there's no free will, then Kant seems to have given us reason to reject morality. The argument can go in different ways, but let's just follow the hard determinist line. So if we come to think that determinism is true, someone might argue in the following way. They might say, deontological ethics is based on the idea that a person's action is morally wrong only if he ought to have chosen differently. The action is wrong only if he ought to have chosen a good intention instead of a bad one. But if someone ought to have chosen differently, that means that he could have chosen differently. If someone ought to have chosen a good intention rather than a bad intention, then he could have chosen the good intention instead. But if determinism is true, then it is never the case that we could have chosen differently. If I chose a bad intention, then I couldn't have chosen a good one. It was inevitable that I would choose the bad intention. Therefore, it seems that if determinism is true, then from the perspective of deontological ethics, no one ever does anything morally wrong. In ordinary life, as well as in deontological ethics, we think that people do in fact behave in morally wrong ways by lying, stealing, harming the innocent. Deontological ethics really seems to capture a lot of the way we think about morality. But if determinism is true, then that entire way of thinking is under threat. For when a person lies, he couldn't have done anything else. When he steals, that was inevitable. When he harms an innocent person, again, that was something that was fixed before his birth. And that means that none of these actions were really morally wrong, because in each case, the person couldn't have done anything else. And that means, the argument goes, that it's inappropriate to say that he ought to have refrained from lying, stealing, or killing. And so the problem we're left with from Kant's ingenious argument is that rather than rescuing free will, Kant may well have provided us with the recipe for moral nihilism. This lecture covered just one of the important normative ethical theories, deontology. And this theory does seem to depend in important ways on the assumption that we have free will. Kant uses that fact to argue for the existence of free will, but it's possible to run this argument in the opposite direction, that we don't have free will, so deontological ethics is deeply misguided. However, the other main approach to figuring out the principles to live by, utilitarianism, doesn't seem so vulnerable to worries about free will. So we'll take that theory up in detail in the next lecture.